So just take a moment to allow your eyes to close and allow yourself to begin to relax. And as you begin to relax, I don't know whether you'll drift asleep faster to the sound of my voice or to the spaces between my words. And as you begin to comfortably drift asleep, I'm just going to tell this sleep meditation in the background. And this sleep meditation is about a young boy who is walking through a meadow along the edge of some woodland. And the other side of that young boy, the other side of the meadow, is the most beautiful, calm lake. And this boy is walking along with a young little unicorn. And it's a white unicorn with some slight pink patches on the unicorn's back and its sides, and a tiny horn that spirals from its forehead. And they're walking along through that meadow, and they can see a large area of tulips blowing so comfortably in the breeze, and tall, thick blades of grass. And as that breeze blows across the grass, they can notice the way that grass moves, noticing the way the blades of grass are darker on one side than the other. So as that breeze blows across the grass, so it appears like dark bands and then light bands, passing one way and then the other across the meadow. And the breeze is just ever so slight, just enough for that boy to feel that comfortable breeze on his face. And they continue on until they find a space where that meadow evens out, and they find some stones, some larger stones, some smaller stones. They set up a camp near the larger stones, where they can sit on those stones. They make a campfire. The young boy goes and gathers some wood, and then lights that fire. And the boy and that unicorn just sit and relax as the sun begins to set in the background. And while the sun sets, the sky begins to turn the most beautiful shades of pinks and reds. And the clouds begin to reflect on the surface of the calm water of the lake. And those pink clouds overhead make it seem almost like the sparkling reflections catching on the waves are like little pink sparkling diamonds in the water. And they can hear the sound of the daytime animals calming down in the woodland behind them, the way the wind is very slightly blowing a breeze through the trees. And they sit and relax as the evening sets in. And the boy looks over at the unicorn and thinks that unicorn looks a bit sad. And the boy asks the unicorn if they're okay. And the unicorn explains that as they were walking along, they saw their reflection in the edge of the lake. And as they walked past and saw their reflection, it noticed that its head looked so large compared to its body. And the boy commented that there's nothing wrong with how the unicorn looks. And the unicorn explained that some of the older unicorns had been taking the mickey out of them because of the size of their head. And so, since then, it's just been playing on their mind. And the boy listened along and was very supportive of the unicorn. And they commented about how they don't see anything at all wrong with how the unicorn looks. But at the same time, they're aware that this is how the unicorn feels. And the unicorn is aware that the boy is entitled to their opinion as well. And after the conversation, they sit in silence for a little while as they listen to the different nighttime sounds beginning to increase as the last glowing from the sun fades over the horizon. And they find something deeply relaxing about these nighttime sounds. And the boy mentions how the young unicorns always start out with different parts of their body growing at different rates. It's very common for many unicorns to have their heads grow slightly faster than their body and their horn, and yet the older unicorns will already have gone through that stage. And the unicorn is aware of this, but still didn't like being picked on for it. And as they sat there and they talked, the unicorn was glad to have a friend like this young boy. They regularly went out on different adventures together. And just then they started to hear this slight popping sound coming from over the lake. And as they gazed out over the lake, under the moonlight, they could see these little sparkles appearing just above the surface of the water. And the sparkles didn't seem to be just a reflection of moonlight. They seemed to be sparkles that were emitting light. And the two of them went to the lake's edge to get a closer look. And at the lake's edge, they could hear that trickling water sound of the water gently rolling in by their feet. And as they looked out over the lake, they could see bubbles rising up from the lake and bursting a short distance above the lake. Some burst almost as soon as they left the water. Others rose just a little bit higher before bursting. But each single one seemed to burst into a sprinkle of sparkling light. And the sparkling light seemed to come from the bubbles themselves, and they were curious what these sparkles were and what these bubbles were. And they watched for a while before hearing a slight humming or buzzing, approaching, getting closer and closer to them. And then after a moment, they saw a green fairy flying into view, and it was a small fairy, and it flew over to them. And the boy held out one of his hands, and the fairy hovered just above his hand, almost touching his hand. And the boy could feel the slight wavy, tickly feeling of the breeze from the fairy's wings beating rapidly. and it was almost like someone waving paper close to her hand, and this fairy began to talk to them. The fairy told them that she wanted to take them on an adventure. She had a mission for them to be involved in. She asked if they were interested, and of course the young boy was interested in adventure. So the three of them set off from the camp, and they headed into the woods. And as they headed deeper and deeper into the woods, the fairy seemed to glow brighter and brighter, as if to illuminate the path ahead. And they followed that fairy deeper and deeper into the woodland. And the fairy's light illuminated the tree trunks, cast different shadows from the branches, the leaves, as they walked deeper and deeper into that woodland. And there was so much less light getting through here, the moonlight could barely penetrate the canopy overhead. And there was very little breeze in here deep in the woods. And as they carried on, walking deeper and deeper into the woods, the boy was curious what they were searching for and what they were going to find. And after a few moments, the fairy seemed to turn off of this path that they were following and turn along a path that seemed like no one had ever trodden it. And they carefully pushed their way between the trees, carefully navigating over roots sticking out from under the ground, around and under and over different branches, around different plants in the ground. And they continued their journey deeper into the woods until they found a specific tree that seemed to be covered in the softest, greenest moss. And the boy gently ran his fingers through and around that moss, feeling almost like he was touching the softest, thickest hair. And he noticed how that moss seemed to have such a soft and cool feel to it. And as he ran his hand around the tree, so he noticed there was a bit of tree sticking out. And the fairy had started to ascend the tree. And as that fairy ascended, the unicorn realized that they can't climb the tree. And the boy didn't want to leave the unicorn at the bottom of the tree. So the fairy said that they can help the unicorn to be able to join in the journey and make it up this tree. And the fairy flew over to the unicorn. She waved her magic wand over the unicorn's head. Sparkles came from the wand, spiraled around, spread out, and spiraled and surrounded the horn of the unicorn, and then continued to spiral with light around the head and the body of the unicorn, with that spiraling, sparkling light getting brighter and brighter, sparkling more and more, like thousands of incredibly tiny twinkling bells spiraling around the unicorn. And then as that spiraling light began to fade and the bells began to quieten down in the background, so the young unicorn was revealed to now have grown wings. And those wings were almost like the wings of a dove. And the unicorn stretched its wings and flexed its wings and beat its wings so gently and so easily and effortlessly the unicorn raised off of the ground. The unicorn seemed to be able to fly with very little use of its wings. And then that fairy flew up into the tree, the boy climbed the tree, and the unicorn followed, flying carefully around the trunk, weaving between the branches, flying higher and higher into the tree. And high up in the tree, they saw a hole into the tree, and the fairy flew through the hole. The boy followed through the hole, and the unicorn followed into the hole. And as they passed through the hole, so it was almost like they were passing from darkness into light. They found themselves exiting the hole at the top of a meadow, and they were looking down over the most beautiful summer's day, over a river, sparkling in the sunlight, birds flying overhead, bunny rabbits hopping around in the meadow, stopping occasionally to nibble at grass and other flowers, and then continuing to hop around again. And the fairy said to keep following and keep up. And so they followed that fairy down through the meadow, all the way down to the river. And the river was a winding river. And so they followed along the edge of this winding river. And eventually they found themselves arriving at an ocean. Down in the distance, in one direction, they could see a ship that looked like a pirate ship, and it looked like there were some small boats coming from that pirate ship up onto the shore. And it looked like perhaps they were heading into a cave, maybe hiding some treasure in the cave. And the boy was excited and wanted to go and see more. But the fairy said that you're on a mission. Sometimes, when you're on a mission, you need to keep focused on that mission. You can't just let every exciting thing distract you. And so with one eye almost fixed on those pirates, the boy followed the fairy in the other direction. And that unicorn is walking along, and occasionally the unicorn would decide to fly. They were trying to decide whether they preferred walking or flying. They found that even when they're flying, their legs seem to act like they're walking through the air. And they continued along, and they could see that there were cliffs in this direction as well, that the ground was rising up into those tall cliffs. And they walked along in front of those tall cliffs, and the fairy guided them towards a cave. And this cave had the ocean also driving itself into that cave. And so as they walked into the cave, they could notice the salty spray from that sea water rolling in, striking the back of the cave, splashing up, crashing back down, and then rolling back out again. And the sunlight from outside the cave occasionally would catch some of that spray of water, and a fleeting rainbow would pass from one side of the cave to the other. And then after a few moments, the water would strike the back of the cave again, more spray would be created, and another rainbow would carefully pass its way across the cave. And it seemed so rhythmic. And they continued to climb up inside that cave, above the water, before turning down a smaller path, heading deeper and deeper into this cave. And while heading deeper and deeper into the cave, they started to notice, after a little while of darkness, with the only light being the light from the fairy, that there seems to be other lights down here. There seem to be flaming torches placed at even spaces apart down the cave corridor and out into a chamber. And as they headed out into the chamber, they could see people milling around, laughing, being friendly with each other, seeming so relaxed. They saw that there was steam seeming to hover a little way off the ground, filling the chamber. And they discovered that this chamber resembles a Roman bath, as if it's been built here deep in this cave on purpose. And there are people in the water relaxing, floating on their backs. Some people socializing in that water. Those floating on their backs seem to just have their ears under the water, listening to the relaxing underwater sounds with their eyes closed, absorbed in their own world as they drift and float in that warm, comfortable water. And the three of them headed past this area down into another tunnel and continued following this tunnel all the way to another chamber. And the boy was curious about who would build a Roman bathhouse like that under the ground. And the fairy explained that there's a hot spring deep under the ground, and as the seawater rolls in, it gets warmed up, it rises up through the ground, it bubbles up into these hot springs. And so they have just built the bathhouse over the top of those salty, hot springs, and that it creates these salty baths that you can lie back on and just float so gently and comfortably on. And the unicorn thought to themselves they'd quite like to just go back and do that. They'd quite like to go into the water and just drift and float and relax. And the fairy explained that we've got a mission, you've got to keep on task. You can't be distracted by every little thing. We need to focus on just one thing at a time, that there'll be time for doing other things later. And so they continued on their journey as that unicorn kept one eye looking back, hearing the sounds of them having fun behind them, receding into the distance as they continued forward, deeper and deeper on their journey. And while they continued forward, they ended up coming out into an even larger chamber. And this chamber is even brighter illuminated, and it seems to have a hole in the roof of the chamber, as if at some point way back in the distant past, this cave had caved in, and so some of that vegetation had began to grow down into the cave where the sunlight had broken through and illuminated areas inside this cave. And not only were there vines hanging down and around the walls and trees growing out from the walls, but the people here had created the most incredible and intricate and the most beautiful hanging garden in this cave, with a certain level of depth and texture with the way the plants had been used. And they could smell the smells of the plants and notice the difference and the changes to the smells of the plants as the slight breeze blew into the chamber and circulated the air, where you just suddenly get a whiff of a different scent of different flowers, and within a few steps you could notice a very different smell of a plant, and then a few more steps you could notice another very different smell of a plant. And looking around, noticing butterflies and bees and other animals moving from plant to plant, and noticing that there seemed to be a whole ecosystem down here in this cave. And the boy really wanted to check out the different parts of the hanging garden. He was fascinated by the way some bits were on different levels, some bits were hanging, some bits were overhanging, and that the hanging garden had been built into what was naturally here, merging the hanging garden in with the natural foliage of this area, managing to give it a natural look. And yet it was clearly designed. And the fairies said, no, we have to keep moving. You can't just let every little thing distract you. We need to keep moving. And so they continued their journey. They continued to walk through this area, and the boy kept one eye on what they really wanted to be exploring, while trying to almost mentally memorize all the different smells as they passed through them. And eventually they arrived at a large wooden arched door. And the fairy hovered near the door and asked the boy to open it, and the boy went over to that door and carefully, with curiosity, opened that door, wondering what would be on the other side, wondering what would be even more impressive or even more important than everything that he's missed out on stopping at thus far. And as he opens the door, so he finds that this is the end of this cave system, that the other side of this door opens out into something that makes him feel a sense of awe and wonder. He sees a large, towering colosseum. And this colosseum is surrounded by the most beautiful fields of corn, with the ears of corn just waving so gently in the breeze. And there was very little else to see in all directions. And the boy had this feeling like time here had slowed right down, almost as if somehow, as he was opening the door, time was slowing down, as if birds were beating their wings slower, as if the corn was waving slower and more relaxed, as if his eyes said that they want everything to slow down, they want to enjoy this moment, they want to savour this moment, they want to take all of this moment in. And as they walked through the door and down towards the Colosseum, they continued to follow a path. And while following the path, they looked around themselves, looking over at the corn, looking at the birds overhead, heading all the way and into the Colosseum. And in the Colosseum, they noticed that the floor seemed to be removed, that it looked like it had a replaceable base, and it looked like parts of that base had been removed to reveal the depths under the Colosseum. And one thing that they could see as they walked into the Colosseum was that the river, which had evidently been weaving its way around the other side of these cliffs and had probably taken a very long, different journey, seemed to have reached this point. And at this point, it was flowing into and underneath the Colosseum, forming a waterfall. And in that waterfall, there was a water wheel. And that water wheel was powering a fountain that was on display in another part of the Colosseum. And they walked down to the base of the Colosseum. They went over near the fountain. The boy put his hands into the water. He splashed a little bit of that water onto his face, over his eyes. He could breathe in the soft smell of the water. He could feel the coolness of that water on his cheeks and over his eyes. And the unicorn followed along, sticking close to that boy. And they then headed in the direction of the waterfall. And they followed some steps down at the far side of the Colosseum to go down under the main surface, all the way down and over to that waterfall. And the fairy led them along the edge of the river as it flowed under the Colosseum, and they could hear behind them that almost thundering sound of the waterfall and the sound of the water wheel creaking in the background. And as they continued, the thundering sound soothed and calmed down in the background, and the water flowed slower and calmed down as that river began to broaden out. And they followed the river into what seemed like another cave here under the Colosseum. And the fairy explained that this channel was made by the water, over thousands of years of this water flowing down into the ground and flowing through this rock. And so this was the perfect place to build this Colosseum, because it allowed very little effort to be able to do some incredible shows, to be able to do fountains on display, to be able to do other water-based displays in the Colosseum. And as they continued to walk along the edge of the river here deep underground, they followed the light of the fairy, and the boy was curious where they were heading. And as they continued, they discovered another door. And the fairy asked the boy to open the door, and they passed in through the door into what was almost like somebody's house, that it looked like somebody lived here, and it was shaped like a cave carved in the rock, made to be something to live in. There was furniture that looked like it had been personally made. There was bits of trees. There was books on the walls. There was various shelves and other items. And lying on the floor by the fireplace was a golden dog, seemingly just resting and sleeping there in front of that fire. And the boy went over to the dog. The boy stroked that dog, could feel the warmth of its fur, could feel the dog breathing in and out in that sleepy, relaxed way. And then the boy started looking at the books on the shelves, and would take some of those old books off the shelves, and would feel the texture of the old paper, would smell those old books, would run his fingers down the paper, down those pages, to feel the way the ink had been written onto the pages. And then the boy heard a man's voice behind him. And the voice said, "You like those books, do you not?" And the boy, slightly startled, knowing that he'd never seen a man there, turned around, and as he turned around, he thought that he had got a glimpse of this man seeming a bit fuzzy, and he wondered whether his eyes had perhaps just struggled to focus for a moment. And then he realized that this man was that golden dog. And the fairy explained that this man is a wizard, and that they are a shapeshifter, and that they're actually a lot more than that, and that some people in the past had referred to them as being a god, and when they're here on earth, they're able to look how they choose to look. They can look like a dog, they can look like a man, or look like anything else they choose. And the man explained that before any guests had arrived, they were feeling sleepy, so they decided to rest in front of the fire. And they know that resting in front of a fire is probably best done as a dog, where you can curl up. You can allow your fur to absorb some of the warmth from the fire, so that it almost feels like you've got an inbuilt blanket hugging you while you relax and sleep. But once he heard guests arriving, and then you came over, woke him up, he knew that he's going to have to engage in some kind of conversation, and so he shifted his appearance to that of a man. And the fairy explained that they're here on a mission, and this wizard asked how they can help. And the wizard spoke with the fairy for a while, and then he spoke with the boy about how brave the boy was, and how impressed he is that this boy has made it this far without being distracted on his journey. And then he excitedly noticed the unicorn, and he swung his arms open and said, "Ah, Pegasus," as he went over and picked him up and gave him a big squeeze, the biggest hug Pegasus had ever received. And he said, "I've been waiting for your arrival for a very long time." And Pegasus said that that isn't their name. And the man said that it is your name. You just didn't know that it was your name yet. He's been waiting a very long time. You have some very important missions to do in the future. And you'll know what you'll be doing in the future when you get there. And this young boy has important things in the future that they'll be doing. And you'll be doing those things together. And I've been waiting a very long time for the two of you to arrive here in this world. And the wizard explained that that's all for another day. That isn't why you're here now. Just be aware that in the future you've got a lot of important things that you'll be doing. And Pegasus was confused by this, but he quite liked the name. And Pegasus decided that he was going to adopt that name from now on, because whenever he heard that name, he almost felt a sense of his chest pushing out, his shoulders pulling back, and a feeling of confidence, like somehow that name meant something to him. And the boy then asked, "What is it that is the mission for him and Peggy to do?" And the boy looked over towards Pegasus and smiled. And the fairy explained that there's a tree that they have to get to, and that this wizard can help them to that tree. She explained what the tree is, and the man said that they know exactly how to help. And they went to one of their many bookcases. He waved his finger along in front of the different books, as if searching for one specific book. And once he'd found it, he'd stopped moving his finger and his hand. He moved his hand forward. He picked the book off the shelf. He opened the book, and on the page that he opened that book at was a circle that looked almost black. And the wizard ran his finger around the circle, and as he did, he made a few noises with his mouth. And while making those noises with his mouth, his eyes seemed to glaze over. And as his eyes glazed over, so the black circle started to form, almost like it was forming into a tunnel that leapt from the page, almost like a twister forming from the book upwards and outwards towards the wall. And as it moved over to a blank space on a wall, it continued to spin faster and faster. And on that wall, it started to form as if it was forming deeper and becoming more solid, and almost turning into a tunnel, and the centre of that circle began to go misty. And the circle looked almost like someone was scribbling rapidly with charcoal on the wall. with mist in the centre becoming denser and denser, until that mist seemed to disappear into the wall. And the circle began to gain more and more depth. And after just a few moments, the mist started to clear, and they could notice that there was now a tunnel leading through to a clearing. They could see a meadow on a hill, and on the centre of that hill was what almost looked like an oak tree. But this oak tree seemed to have slightly glistening leaves. And the wizard said, "Okay, off you go." And the fairy, Pegasus, and the boy walked through that hole in the wall and out into the meadow. And in every direction they looked was blue sky, white fluffy clouds, and just this meadow endlessly going on in all directions was just that one tree in the middle with the most beautiful wild flowers surrounding it. There was no sign of any other animals, no sign or sounds of birds, and they walked towards that tree. And as they got closer to that tree, so the boy noticed that the leaves on the tree seemed to be shimmering with a slight golden hue. And the boy thought perhaps there was some water resting on those leaves, being caught in an evening sun. And as they arrived at the tree, the fairy said that we need to pick as many of the leaves as we can. And the boy asked, could she not have made this journey herself? Were they really needed to come along with her? And the fairy explained that there are some doors that she wouldn't have been able to get through because of her size, and that these leaves aren't as easy as you imagine to pick, and you'll find out why when you try. And so the boy said that he'll climb the tree and he'll try. And the boy found that he couldn't manage to get a grip on the trunk to climb the tree. So the fairy said that you were both needed. And the boy climbed onto Pegasus' back, and Pegasus gently flapped their wings and started to trot gently off the ground, up into the air, spiralling, trotting gently around the trunk of the tree, rising up that tree to the level of the leaves. And the boy grabbed one of the leaves and had to pull hard on the leaf with two hands to try to just get that one leaf pulled off the tree. And as he pulled that leaf off the tree, it came off almost with a snap, and it was significantly heavier than he expected it to be. And the boy asked the fairy, "What is it with these leaves?" And he asked, "Why are they so heavy?" And the fairy explained that this tree is a magical tree. It's grown on a site that's got a lot of gold buried underneath it. And because of the way this tree works, it sucks up tiny particles of that gold, which spread up through the tree and spread out into the leaves. And the leaves fill with that gold. And eventually there's no room left in the leaves for anything else. And the only way for this tree to grow new leaves is for the old leaves to be plucked down. And so that's what they're here to do, to pluck down as many of those leaves as they can. And once the leaves are plucked down, the remaining leaves will then be able to fall from the tree, and then the tree will grow new, fresh leaves over a period of time. And the fairy explained that we need these leaves for a specific purpose. And they pluck as many of those leaves down as they can, and as many as they can carry, and they continue their journey back, with Pegasus carrying many of the leaves on his back, and the boy carrying as many leaves as he can carry, and the fairy trying to carry some leaves too. And they continue their journey back through the meadow, back through that portal into that house, and the wizard asks if they've got what they came for, and the fairy says that they do. And the wizard says, "I'll see you two in the future when you're all grown up. You have important work to do." And then they leave, and they find their way back to the Colosseum. They find their way back to that fountain. They find their way back through to the hanging garden, this time stopping and enjoying some time at the hanging garden, taking plenty of time to rest and relax in this hanging garden, before going through to the baths. And at the baths, Pegasus runs towards the water, leaps in the air, pulls his wings in, and dive bombs into the water, making the largest splash. And the boy carefully just walks in from the edge, turns to face his back to the water, lowers himself down so that his shoulders are under the water, and then gently pushes off from the edge, floating on the surface, while the fairy waits off at the side of the pool for the two of them to finish having their fun. And after a while, the two of them leave the baths with the fairy, find their way back through the cave, find they're all the way back to the seashore. And back at the seashore they walk along and can see that the pirate ship seems to have gone. And the boy is curious whether they should explore that cave and see what the pirates left there. But they decide that that's something they can do another day, and for now they'll just continue their journey. They find the way back to coming out in the woodland, discovering that it's still night time here. They descend the tree, head back through the woods, find their way back to that path, find their way along the path, all the way back to the lake. And once they're back at the lake, the boy and Pegasus wonder what these leaves are needed for, and the fairy explains that the first thing to do with these leaves is to make a campfire and to boil some water over the campfire. And so the boy makes the campfire again and starts boiling some water. The fairy says that now you just need to drop the leaves into the water. So the boy carefully drops those leaves into the water and notices that the leaves themselves begin to disintegrate in the boiling water. And the leaf seems to separate from the gold within the leaf, from the veiny-looking structure of the leaf. And then they take the water off the heat, and while that water is cooling down, the fairy tells stories about otherworldly things, things to discover in the future. And once the water has cooled enough, they carefully take those leaves out of the water, and they realize that it's now just gold in the shape of the veins of the leaf. And the fairy explains that these are needed to be placed in this lake for the next generation of fairies that will be born, that these leaves will sink to the bottom of the lake. They'll sink down deep into the silt in the bottom of the lake. And as the next generation of fairies are born in the future, so these leaves will become the wings of those next generation of fairies, that these golden veins of the leaves will become the wings of those fairies of the future. That her wings came from someone doing this many years ago. The boy was curious how this works, and the fairy explained that she doesn't know, that it seems to be magic. They seem to settle on the silt, sink into the silt, and the fairies are born within the lake. And it's just known the fairies suddenly spring into life, suddenly exist and have consciousness, and then they swim to the surface in a bubble of air. And that bubble of air is reinforced with the sparkling energy of magic. And as those bubbles break the surface, it's almost like breaking out of an egg. They break free of that bubble of air in a sparkle of light. And what were once heavy and golden are now soft and supple, are lighter than feather wings. And the fairy gently lands on the boy's hand so that she can just stand there and relax her wings. And until this point, the boy had only ever seen a slight blur behind the body of the fairy, where the wings were beating so fast. And now, with her stationery gently resting on his hand, he could see the wings illuminated by the fire, by the moonlight. He could see the golden colour. He could see how delicate the wings were. He could see the veins of the wings and how leaf-like they looked. And then the fairy launched again off of his hand, and the wings turned back to a blur. And after the boy helped the fairy, the boy and the unicorn settled down for the night to relax and sleep and camp out for the night. and the next day they headed home, excited by the experience that they had had. And they tried to tell others about their experience, but nobody seemed to believe them. But they knew that the experience was real. They knew that they would be having some future experiences. And they decided that they don't mind what others think. The important thing is their knowledge and what they think. And that night, while thinking of what these future experiences and adventures are going to be, the two of them smiled and relaxed and drifted and floated so peacefully, so comfortably and so relaxed, asleep for the night.